Section 17 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Eves, Section 17. The Borgias, Chapter 9. Everything from without was favoring Alexander's encroaching policy when he was compelled to turn his eyes from France towards the center of Italy. In Florence dwelt a man, neither duke, nor king, nor soldier, a man whose power was in his genius, whose armor was his purity, who owed no offensive weapon but his tongue, and who yet began to grow more dangerous for him than all the kings, dukes, princes, and the whole world could ever be. This man was the poor Dominican monk Girolamo Savonarola, the same who had refused absolution to Lorenzo de' Medici because he would not restore the liberty of Florence. Girolamo Savonarola had prophesied the invasion of a force from beyond the Alps, and Charles VIII had conquered Naples. Girolamo Savonarola had prophesied that Charles VIII, that because he had failed to fulfill the mission of liberator entrusted to him by God, he was threatened with a great misfortune as a punishment, and Charles was dead. Lastly, Savonarola had prophesied his own fall, like the man who paced around the holy city for 8 days, crying, "Woe to Jerusalem!" and on the 9th day, "Woe be on my own head!" Nonetheless, the Florentine reformer, who could not recoil from any danger, was determined to attack the colossal abomination that was seated on St. Peter's holy throne. Each debauch, each fresh crime that lifted up its brazen face to the light of day, or tried to hide its shameful head beneath the veil of night, he had never failed to paint out to the people, denouncing it as the offspring of the Pope's luxurious living and lust of power. Thus had he stigmatized Alexander's new amour with the beautiful Giulia Farnese, who, in the preceding April, added another son to the Pope's family. Thus had he cursed the Duke of Gandia's murderer, the lustful Julius Fratricide. Lastly, he had pointed out to the Florentines, who were excluded from the league then forming, what sort of future was in store for them when the Borgias should have made themselves masters of small principalities and should come to attack the ducates and republics. It was clear that in Savonarola the Pope had an enemy at once, temporal and spiritual, whose importunate and threatening voice must be silenced at any cost. But mighty as the Pope's power was, to accomplish a design like this was no easy matter. Savonarola, preaching the stern principles of liberty, had united to his cause, even in the midst of rich, pleasure-loving Florence, a body of some size, known as the Piagnoni, or the penitents. This band was composed of citizens who were anxious for reforming church and state, who accused the Medici of enslaving the fatherland and the Borgias of upsetting the faith, who demanded two things: that the republic should return to her democratic principles, and religion to a primitive simplicity. Towards the first of these projects considerable progress had been made, since they had successively obtained, first, an amnesty for all crimes and delinquencies committed under other governments; secondly, the abolition of the Balia, which was an aristocratic magistracy; thirdly, the establishment of a sovereign council composed of 1,800 citizens; and lastly, the substitution of popular elections for drawing by lot and for oligarchical nominations. These changes had been effected in spite of two other factions, the Arrabbiati, or madmen, who, consisting of the richest and noblest youths of the Florentine patrician families, desired to have an oligarchical government, and the Bigi, or Greys, so called because they always held their meetings in the shade, who desired the return of the Medici. The first measure Alexander used against the growing power of Savonarola was to declare him heretic, and as such banished from the pulpit. But Savonarola had eluded this prohibition by making his pupil and friend, Domenico Bombicini di Pescia, preach in his stead. The result was that the master's teachings were issued from other lips, and that was all. The seed, though scattered by another hand, fell none the less on fertile soil, where it would soon burst into flower. Moreover, Savonarola now set an example that was followed to good purpose by Luther, when 22 years later he burned Leo X's bolt of excommunication at Wittenberg. He was weary of silence, so he declared, on the authority of Pope Pelagius, that an unjust excommunication had no efficacy, and that the person excommunicated unjustly did not even need to get absolution. So, on Christmas Day, 1497, he declared that, by the inspiration of God, he renounced his obedience to a corrupt master, and he began to preach once more in the cathedral, with a success that was all the greater for the interruption, and an influence far more formidable than before, because it was strengthened by that sympathy of the masses which an unjust persecution always inspires. Then Alexander made overtures to Leonardo de' Medici, vicar of the Archbishopric of Florence, to obtain the punishment of the rebel Leonardo. In obedience to the orders he received from Rome, issued a mandate forbidding the faithful to attend at Savonarola's sermons. After this mandate, any who should hear the discourses of the excommunicated monk would be refused communion and confession, and as when they died they would be contaminated with heresy in consequence of their spiritual intercourse with a heretic, their dead bodies would be dragged on a hurdle and deprived of the rites of sepulture. Savonarola appealed from the mandate of his superior both to the people and to the Signoria, and the two together gave orders to the episcopal vicar to leave Florence within 2 hours. This happened at the beginning of the year 1498. The expulsion of Leonardo de' Medici was a new triumph for Savonarola, so, wishing to turn to good moral account his growing influence, he resolved to convert the last day of the carnival, hitherto given up to worldly pleasures, into a day of religious sacrifice. So actually, on Shrub Tuesday, a considerable number of boys were collected in front of the cathedral, and there divided into bands, which traversed the whole town, making a house-to-house visitation, claiming all profane books, licentious paintings, lutes, harps, cards and dice, cosmetics and perfumes. In a word, all the hundreds of products of a corrupt society and civilization, by the aid of which Satan at times makes victorious war on God. The inhabitants of Florence obeyed, and came forth to the piazza of the Duomo, bringing these works of perdition, which were soon piled up in a huge sack, which the youthful reformers set on fire, singing religious psalms and hymns the while. On this pile were burned many copies of Boccaccio and of Morgante Maggiore, and pictures of Fra Bartolomeo, who from that day forward renounced the art of this world, to consecrate his brush utterly and entirely to the reproduction of religious scenes. A reform such as this was terrifying to Alexander, so he resolved on fighting Savonarola with his own weapons, that is, by the force of eloquence. He chose as the Dominican's opponent a preacher of recognized talent called Fra Francesco di Paggia, and he sent him to Florence, where he began to preach in Santa Croce, accusing Savonarola of heresy and impiety. At the same time, the Pope, in a new brief, announced that to the Signoria that unless they forbade the arch-heretic to preach, all the goods of Florentine merchants who lived on the papal territory would be confiscated, and the Republic laid on an interdict and declared the spiritual and temporal enemy of the Church. The Signoria, abandoned by France, and aware that the material power of Rome was increasing in a frightful manner, was forced to this time to yield, and to issue to Savonarola an order to leave off preaching. He obeyed, and bade farewell to his congregation in a sermon full of strength and eloquence. But the withdrawal of Savonarola, so far from calming the ferment, had increased it. There was talk about his prophecies being fulfilled, and some zealots, more ardent than their mastery, added miracle to inspiration, and loudly proclaimed that Savonarola had offered to go down into the vaults of the cathedral with his antagonist, and there bring a dead man to life again, to prove that his doctrine was true, promising to declare himself vanquished if the miracle were performed by his adversary. These rumors reached the ears of Fra Francesco, and as he was a man of warm blood who counted his own life as nothing if it might be spent to help his cause, he declared in all humility that he felt he was too great a sinner for God to work a miracle in his behalf. But he proposed another challenge. He would try with Savonarola the ordeal of fire. He knew, he said, that he must perish, but at least he should perish avenging the cause of religion, since he was certain to involve in his destruction the tempter who plunged so many souls, beside his own, into eternal damnation. The proposition made by Fra Francesco was taken to Savonarola, but as he had never proposed the earlier challenge, he hesitated to accept the second. Hereupon his disciple, Fra Domenico Bonvicini, more confident than his master in his own power, declared himself ready to accept the trial by fire in his stead. So certain was he that God would perform a miracle by the intercession of Savonarola, his prophet. Instantly the report spread through Florence that the mortal challenge was accepted. Savonarola's partisans, all men of the strongest convictions, felt no doubt as to the success of their cause. His enemies were enchanted at the thought of the heretic giving himself to the flames, and the indifferent saw in the ordeal a spectacle of real and terrible interest. But the devotion of Fra Bonvicini of Pescia was not what Fra Francesco was reckoning with. He was willing, no doubt, to die a terrible death, but on condition that Savonarola died with him. What mattered to him the death of an obscure disciple like Fra Bonvicini? It was the master he would strike, the great teacher who must be involved in his own ruin. So he refused to enter the fire except with Savonarola himself, and, playing this terrible game in his own person, would not allow his adversary to play it by proxy. Then a thing happened which certainly no one could have anticipated. In the place of Fra Francesco, who would not tilt with any but the master, two Franciscan monks appeared to tilt with the disciple. These were Fra Nicolas de Pili and Fra Andrea Rondinelli. Immediately the partisans of Savonarola, seeing this arrival of reinforcements for their antagonist, came forward in a crowd to try the ordeal. The Franciscans were unwilling to be behindhand, and everybody took sides with equal ardor for one or another party. All Florence was like a den of madmen. Everyone wanted the ordeal. Everyone wanted to go into the fire. Not only did men challenge one another, but women and even children were clamoring to allowed to try. At last the Signoria, reserving this privilege for the first applicants, ordered that the strange duel should take place only between Fra Domenico Bonvicini and Fra Andrea Rondinelli. 10 of the citizens were to arrange all the details. The fixed for the 7th of April, 1498, and the place the Piazza del Palazzo. The judges of the field made their arguments conscientiously. By their orders a scaffolding was erected at the appointed place, 5 feet in height, 10 in width, and 8 feet long. This scaffolding was covered with faggots and heat, supported by crossbars of the very driest wood that could be found. 2 narrow paths were made, 2 feet wide at most, their entrance given, and the Loggia dei Lanzi, their exit exactly opposite. The loggia was itself divided into 2 by a partition, so that each champion had a kind of room to make his preparations in, just as in the theater every actor has his dressing room. But in this instance the tragedy was about to be played was not a fictitious one. The Franciscans arrived in the piazza and entered the compartment reserved for them without making any religious demonstration, while Savonarola, on the contrary, advanced to his own place in the procession, wearing the sacerdotal robes in which he had just celebrated the Holy Eucharist, and holding in his hand the sacred host for all the world to see, as it was enclosed in a crystal tabernacle. Fra Domenico di Pescia, the hero of the occasion, followed, bearing a crucifix, and all the Dominican monks, their red crosses in their hands, marched behind, singing a psalm. while behind them again followed the most considerable of the citizens of their party, bearing torches, for sure as they were the triumph of their cause, they wished to fire the fagots themselves. The piazza was so crowded that the people overflowed into all the streets around. In every door and window there was nothing to be seen but heads ranged one above the other. The terraces were covered with people, and curious spectators were observed at the roof of the Duomo and on the top of the Campanile. But, face to face with the ordeal, the Franciscans raised such difficulties that it was very plain the heart of their champion was failing him. The first fear they expressed was that Fra Bombincini was an enchanter, and so carried about him some talisman of charm which would save him from the fire. So they insisted that he should be stripped of all his clothes and put on others to be inspected by witnesses. Fra Bombincini made no objection, though the suspicion was humiliating. He changed shirt, dress, and cowl. Then, when the Franciscans observed that Savonarola was placing the tabernacle in his hands, they protested that it was profanation to expose the sacred host to the risk of burning, that this was not in the bond, and if Bombincini would not give up his supernatural aid, they for their part would give up the trial altogether. Savonarola replied that this was not astonishing that the champion of religion who put his faith in God should bear in his hands that very God to whom he entrusted his salvation. But this reply did not satisfy the Franciscans, who were unwilling to let go of their contention. Savonarola remained inflexible, supporting his own right, and thus nearly 4 hours passed in the discussion of points which neither party would give up, and affairs remained in statu quo. Meanwhile, the people, jammed together in the streets, on the terraces, on the roofs, since break of day, were suffering from hunger and thirst and beginning to get impatient. Their impatience soon developed into loud murmurs, which reached even the champion's ears, so that the partisans of Savonarola, who felt such faith in him that they were confident of a miracle, entreated him to yield to all the conditions suggested. To this Savonarola replied that if it were himself making the trial, he would be less inexorable, but since another man was incurring the danger, he could not take too many precautions. 2 more hours passed, while his partisans tried in vain to combat his refusals. At last, as night was coming on, and the people grew even more and more impatient, and their murmurs began to assume a threatening tone, Bombincini declared that he was ready to walk through the fire, holding nothing in his hands but a crucifix. No one could refuse him this, so Fra Rondinelli was compelled to accept his proposition. The announcement was made to the populace that the champions had come to terms, and the trial was about to take place. At this news the people calmed down, in the hope of being compensated at last for their long wait. But at that very moment a storm, which had long been threatening, broke over Florence with such fury that the fagots which had just been lighted were extinguished by the rain, leaving no possibility of their rekindling. From the moment when the people suspected that they had been fooled, their enthusiasm was changed into derision. They were ignorant from which side the difficulties had arisen that had hindered the trial, so they laid the responsibility on both champions without distinction. The Signoria, foreseeing the disorder that was now imminent, ordered the assembly to retire, but the assembly thought otherwise and stayed on the piazza, waiting for the departure of the 2 champions, in spite of their fearful rain that still fell in torrents. Rondinelli was taken back amid shouts and hootings, and pursued with showers of stones. Savonarola, thanks to his sacred garments and the host which he still carried, passed calmly enough through the midst of the mob, a miracle quite as remarkable as if he had passed through the fire unscathed. But it was only the sacred majesty of the host that protected this man, who was indeed from this moment regarded as a false prophet. The crowd allowed Savonarola to return to his convent, but they regretted the necessity, so excited were they by the Arrabbiati party, who had always denounced him as a liar and a hypocrite. So when the next morning, Palm Sunday, he stood up in the pulpit to explain his conduct, he could not obtain a moment's silence from insults, hooting, and loud laughter. Then the outcry, at first derisive, became menacing. Savonarola, whose voice was too weak to subdue the tumult, descended from his pulpit, retired into the sacristy, and thence to his convent, where he shut himself up in his cell. At the moment a cry was heard, and was repeated to everybody present. To San Marco! To San Marco! The rioters, few at first, were recruited by all the populace as they swept along the streets, and at last reached the convent, dashing like an angry sea against the wall. The doors, closed on Savonarola's entrance, soon crashed before the vehement onset of the powerful multitude, which struck down on the instant every obstacle it met. The whole convent was quickly flooded with people, and Savonarola, with two of his confederates, Domenico Bombincini and Silvestro Maruffi, was arrested in his cell and conducted to prison amid the insults of the crowd, who, always in extremes, whether of enthusiasm or hatred, would have liked to tear them to pieces, and would not be quieted till they had exacted the promise that the prisoners should be forcibly compelled to make the trial of fire which they have refused to make of their own free will. Alexander VI, as we may suppose, had not been without influence in bringing about this sudden and astonishing reaction, although he was not present in person, and had scarcely learned the news of Savonarola's fall and arrest when he claimed him as subject to ecclesiastical jurisdiction. But in spite of the grant of indulgences wherewith this demand was accompanied, the Signoria insisted that Savonarola's trial should take place at Florence, adding a request so as to not appear to withdraw the accused completely from the pontifical authority, that the Pope would send 2 ecclesiastical judges to sit in the Florentine tribunal. Alexander, seeing that he would get nothing better from the magnificent republic, sent as deputies Gioacchino Turriano Benic, general of the Dominicans, and Francesco Ramolini, doctor in law. They practically brought the sentence with them, declaring Savonarola and his accomplices heretics, schismatics, persecutors of the church, and seducers of the people. The firmness shown by the Florentines in claiming the rights of jurisdiction were nothing but an empty show to save appearances. The tribunal, as a fact, was composed of 8 members, all known to be fervent haters of Savonarola, whose trial began with the torture. The result was that, feeble in body, constitutionally nervous and irritable, he had not been able to endure the rack, and, overcome by agony, just at the moment when the executioner had lifted him up by the wrists and then dropped him at a distance of 2 feet to the ground, he had confessed, in order to get some respite, that his prophecies were nothing more than conjectures. If it is true that so soon as he went back to prison he protested against the confession, saying that it was the weakness of his bodily organs and his wanton firmness that had wrested the life from him, but that the truth really was that the Lord had several times appeared to him in his ecstasies and revealed the things that he had spoken. This protestation led to a new application of the torture, during which Savonarola succumbed once more to the dreadful pain, and once more retracted. But scarcely was he unbound, and was still lying on the bed of torture, when he declared that his confessions were the fault of his tortures, and the vengeance would recoil upon their heads. And he protested yet once more against all he had confessed and might confess again. A third time the torture produced the same avowals, and the relief that followed it the same retractions. The judges, therefore, when they condemned him and his 2 disciples to the flames, decided that his confession should not be read aloud at the stake, according to custom, feeling certain that, in this occasion, also he would give it the lie, and that publicly, which, as anyone must see who knew the versatile spirit of the republic, would be a most dangerous proceeding. On the 23rd of May, the fire which had been promised to the people before was a second time prepared on the Piazza del Palazzo, and this time the crowd assembled quite certain that they would not be disappointed of a spectacle so long anticipated. And towards 11 o'clock in the morning, Girolamo Savonarola, Domenico Bombincini, and Silvestro Maruffi were led to the place of execution, the greater of their orders by the ecclesiastical judges, and bound all 3 to the same stake, in the center of an immense pile of wood. Then the bishop Pagnanoli told the condemned men that he cut them off from the church. I, from the church militant, said Savonarola, who from that very hour, thanks to his martyrdom, was entering into the church triumphant. No other words were spoken by the condemned men, for at this moment one of the Arrabbiati, a personal enemy of Savonarola, breaking through the hedge of guards around the scaffold, snatched the torch from the executioner's hand and himself set fire to the four corners of the pile. Savonarola and his disciples, from the moment when they saw the smoke arise, began to sing a psalm, and the flames enwrapped them on all sides with a glowing bile, and the religious song was yet heard mounting upward to the gates of heaven. Pope Alexander VI was thus set free from perhaps the most formidable enemy who had ever risen against him, and the pontifical vengeance pursued the victims even after their death. The Signoria, yielding to his wishes, gave orders that the ashes of the prophet and his disciples should be thrown into the Arno. But certain half-burned fragments were picked up by the very soldiers whose business it was to keep the people back from approaching the fire, and the holy relics are even now shown, blackened by the flames, to the faithful who, if they no longer regard Savonarola as a prophet, revere him none the less as a martyr.